The morning sun had barely risen when I found myself standing quietly beside my garden, watering the same roses I had planted almost 15 years ago. Retirement has a way of teaching you to appreciate life's simplest moments. The sound of birds singing outside your window suddenly becomes more valuable than any business meeting ever was. At least, that's what most people believe. My name is William Carter. I'm 72 years old, a widower, a father of one beautiful daughter, and the proud grandfather of two wonderful children. To everyone who knows me, I'm simply an old retired man living a quiet and ordinary life. And honestly, I've always preferred it that way. Every Sunday afternoon, my daughter Emily brings her family to visit me for dinner. It has become our little tradition over the years. My grandson Ethan always asks for extra mashed potatoes, while my granddaughter Sophie insists on helping me bake apple pie in the kitchen. Those moments have become infinitely more valuable to me than anything money could ever buy. Then there's my son-in-law, Daniel. Daniel is 45 years old, intelligent, hardworking, and remarkably successful. He's the kind of man people admire immediately after meeting him. Organized, responsible, ambitious, the sort of person who plans his entire week before Monday morning even arrives. If I'm being fair, he's also been a wonderful husband to my daughter for the past 12 years. There is only one thing about Daniel that has always made me smile quietly to myself. He worries about me, constantly. Dad, are you sure you're managing your retirement savings properly? Dad, you really shouldn't be spending money on us every Sunday. Dad, have you considered simplifying your finances a little? Over the years, I've heard every variation of those questions imaginable. At first, I found them amusing. Later, I realized they came from a place of genuine concern. Daniel has always believed I live comfortably but modestly on my retirement income. As far as he knows, I spent most of my life working an ordinary job before retiring quietly several years ago. He's never had any reason to believe otherwise. That misunderstanding has lasted for 12 years. I've never corrected him because he never asked. People often assume older generations enjoy talking about their accomplishments. I've always been the opposite. There is something peaceful about allowing people to know you only as the person sitting across from them today. Besides, I retired from that part of my life a very long time ago. Or so they believed. Last Christmas, Daniel surprised me with an expensive leather wallet. I thanked him warmly before immediately transferring my driver's license and $20 into it. He laughed softly when he noticed. Dad, he smiled. You really don't need much to be happy, do you? No, I laughed. Not anymore. He smiled proudly at my answer. Looking back now, I realize we were both smiling for entirely different reasons. You see, Daniel has always mistaken simplicity for limitation. He believes I live modestly because I have no other choice. He sees my small home, my old pickup truck, and my simple lifestyle as evidence of a lifetime of careful financial planning. In reality, they were simply choices I made many years ago. The truth is, I've spent the better part of my life discovering that peace becomes considerably more valuable than possessions once you've had enough time to appreciate both. There is another thing you should know about Daniel. He's incredibly successful in his career. 5 years ago, he became the chief executive officer of one of the fastest growing companies in our state. I still remember the excitement in his voice when he called to share the news with our family. Emily cried tears of happiness that evening. Ethan proudly announced to everyone at school that his father was now a CEO. Sophie insisted on drawing him a congratulatory card covered with colorful stars and hearts. I was proud of him too, more proud than he could possibly imagine. Every Sunday, he tells me stories about the challenges of leading such a large company. He speaks passionately about his employees, upcoming projects, and the difficult decisions he faces each day. I've listened quietly to those stories for 5 years now, never once interrupting, never once correcting him, and never once telling him the truth. Sometimes life has an extraordinary sense of humor, because while my son-in-law believes he knows everything about my retirement, there is one secret I've carefully kept hidden for the last 12 years. The company Daniel proudly leads every single day exists because I built it, and he has absolutely no idea who signs his paycheck. Daniel has always been fascinated by success stories. Whenever we sat together after Sunday dinner, he loved talking about the people he admired most in business. Founders who started with nothing and built something extraordinary. Leaders who inspired thousands of employees. Men and women who created opportunities for generations of families. You know what amazes me most? He asked one evening while pouring himself another cup of coffee. The best founders always think differently from everyone else. Oh, I smiled. How so? They understand sacrifice, he explained confidently. People only see what they've accomplished. They never see what they gave up to build it. There was something strangely amusing about hearing those words from him. After all, he was absolutely right. Have you ever met the founder of your company? I asked casually. He laughed immediately before shaking his head. No one's ever met him. Really? Well, not exactly no one, he corrected himself. A few members of the board have met him over the years. He's incredibly private. I smiled quietly before taking another sip of my coffee. That must make things interesting. You have no idea. For the next 20 minutes, he enthusiastically explained how mysterious the company's founder had always been. Most employees knew almost nothing about him. There were stories, of course. Some people believed he lived overseas. Others thought he had retired decades ago. There was even an amusing rumor that he spent most of his time traveling around the world. Human imagination has always entertained me. What's he like? I finally asked. Daniel laughed once again. No one really knows. No photographs? Not that I've ever seen. No interviews? Never. What about company events? He never attends them. For several moments, I simply smiled quietly to myself. That's unfortunate. Actually, Daniel replied thoughtfully, I don't think so. Oh? He leaned back comfortably in his chair before continuing. I think he's earned the right to live however he wants. I found myself liking that answer more than I expected. Daniel has many admirable qualities. Respect has always been one of them. The company changes people's lives, he continued proudly. We've provided jobs for thousands of families over the years. His eyes immediately brightened as he spoke about the employees who had worked alongside him for decades. He remembered their children's birthdays, celebrated their promotions, and quietly paid for several employees' medical expenses when difficult times arrived unexpectedly. That was another reason I loved him like my own son. Money has never impressed me. Character always has. There are moments throughout our lives when we become exactly who we choose to be. Daniel had become an exceptional leader because he genuinely cared about the people who depended upon him. Ironically, he simply didn't realize he had inherited that philosophy from someone sitting only a few feet away. Several weeks later, Emily invited me to dinner at their home to celebrate Daniel's 5th anniversary as CEO. The entire family gathered together that evening. Sophie proudly presented her father with a handmade congratulations card, while Ethan joked that someday he planned to become an even better CEO than his father. Daniel laughed warmly before pointing toward me. If anyone's going to teach you about retirement, your grandfather is the expert. Everyone laughed at his comment, including me. Emily smiled before asking, Dad, have you ever missed working? Sometimes. What do you miss most? For several moments, I considered my answer carefully. The people, I finally replied. Daniel smiled knowingly before responding, That's exactly what I tell people all the time. I couldn't help but laugh quietly to myself. There are conversations in life that become infinitely more amusing when only one person knows the entire truth. Later that evening, Daniel walked me to my car before placing his hand gently on my shoulder. You know something, Dad? What's that? I hope my retirement looks exactly like yours someday. I smiled warmly at him before asking, What does that look like? He laughed softly before answering, Simple. There was no insult hidden within that word, no disrespect. He genuinely admired the life I appeared to live. He simply misunderstood how I arrived here. You've done very well for yourself, I told him honestly. So have you, he replied immediately. The sincerity in his voice surprised me. You really think so? Absolutely. He smiled proudly before continuing. You built an incredible family, Dad. I don't think success gets much bigger than that. At 72 years old, I have learned there are moments when life rewards us unexpectedly. That was one of them. Because despite everything he didn't know about me, Daniel had somehow managed to understand the most important truth of all. Success was never about money. It never has been. What neither of us realized that evening was how dramatically our lives were about to change. Because 12 years of assumptions have an interesting way of revealing themselves when people finally begin asking the right questions. For 12 years, Daniel has worried about my finances more than anyone else in our family. I suppose that's what happens when you spend your career helping people make wise financial decisions. Eventually, you begin seeing retirement plans and investment strategies everywhere you look, including at Sunday dinner. Dad, he asked one afternoon while helping me carry dishes into the kitchen, have you updated your will recently? I laughed softly before looking back at him. Should I be concerned about that question? He immediately laughed. Only if I've become significantly more evil since breakfast. There was something wonderfully predictable about Daniel. He genuinely cared about the people he loved. Unfortunately, He occasionally expressed that love through spreadsheets and financial advice. I'm serious, he continued. It's important to keep everything organized. Everything is organized. When was the last time you reviewed it? Several years ago. He stopped walking and looked at me with genuine concern. Dad, that's exactly what worries me. What does? You never worry about these things. I smiled quietly before replying. Perhaps that's because I've spent most of my life learning which things deserve my worries. He laughed before shaking his head. You make retirement sound like some kind of philosophical achievement. Perhaps it is. That answer earned another laugh from him. Moments like these happen more often than I could count over the years. Daniel wasn't controlling or disrespectful. Quite the opposite, actually. He simply viewed me through the same lens he used for every retired person he had ever met. A good man living quietly on his savings, who occasionally needed a little help navigating the realities of growing older. And honestly, I never blamed him for believing that. After all, I had spent 12 years carefully allowing him to believe exactly that. Several months ago, Emily invited the entire family to celebrate Sophie's birthday at their home. While helping Daniel prepare dinner, he mentioned something that stayed with me long after I returned home that evening. You know, he smiled. I've been thinking about retirement a lot lately. That seems rather ambitious for someone who's only 45. He laughed before continuing. I don't mean now. I mean someday. What about it? He smiled thoughtfully before answering. I think I'd like mine to look like yours. There was that compliment again. Simple, peaceful, ordinary. You've said that before. Because I mean it. He placed another plate onto the dining table before continuing. You don't need much to be happy, Dad. I admire that. Looking back now, I realize those words reveal more about Daniel than perhaps anything else he has ever said to me. He genuinely admired simplicity because success had cost him so much complexity throughout his own life. Board meetings, financial reports, business trips, endless responsibilities waiting patiently for him every morning before sunrise. Meanwhile, I spent my mornings watering roses and teaching my grandchildren how to bake apple pie. Who wouldn't envy that occasionally? What would retirement look like for you? I asked curiously. He laughed softly before considering the question. A small house somewhere quiet, more time with Emily, watching my grandchildren grow up someday. No yachts? God no. Private islands? He laughed loudly enough to attract curious looks from Emily in the kitchen. Definitely not. I smiled warmly at his answer. It's funny, he continued thoughtfully. People spend their entire lives chasing success only to realize they wanted peace all along. For several moments, I simply sat quietly beside him. There are times throughout our lives when people accidentally discover profound truths while speaking about something entirely different. This was one of those moments. Daniel had unknowingly described the very reason I chose to disappear quietly from the world I once occupied. Success had given me opportunities beyond anything I ever imagined possible. Retirement gave me something infinitely more valuable. Freedom. Later that evening, I overheard Daniel speaking quietly with Emily in their living room. Your father worries me sometimes. That immediately caught my attention. Why? Emily asked. Because he never spends money on himself. Emily laughed softly. Dad has been like that his entire life. I know, but he's getting older. There was genuine concern in his voice now. I've been thinking about asking him if he'd let me look over his retirement account someday. Emily smiled knowingly before replying, Good luck with that. He trusts me. That's not the problem, she laughed quietly. Dad simply doesn't like people worrying about him. There was a brief silence before Daniel spoke again. I know. His next words surprised me more than he could possibly imagine. I suppose I worry because I love him. For several moments, I remained quietly outside the room before returning to help Ethan finish setting the dinner table. People often assume family conflicts begin with cruelty or selfishness. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they begin with love. Daniel wasn't preparing to interfere in my life because he wanted something from me. He was preparing to do so because he genuinely believed I needed him. And perhaps that's what made the truth waiting patiently between us so much more complicated than either of us realized. The following Sunday began exactly like every other Sunday before it. Emily brought apple pie. Ethan raced toward the garden before I could even open the front door. Sophie immediately announced that she planned to help me make dinner whether I needed assistance or not. And Daniel arrived carrying concern hidden behind a warm smile. Some things never change. Dad, he laughed as he stepped inside. You really need to stop carrying groceries by yourself. I'm carrying a loaf of bread. Exactly my point. Emily laughed immediately. He's been practicing that speech all week. I smiled quietly before placing my hand gently on his shoulder. One day you'll discover 72 isn't nearly as old as 45 imagines it to be. That earned me my grandson's laughter from across the room. By now, our conversations had become something of a family tradition. Daniel worried about my retirement while I reminded him that growing older wasn't a medical condition requiring immediate intervention. Everyone seemed perfectly happy with this arrangement. At dinner, our conversation unexpectedly turned toward work. We have our annual leadership conference next month, Daniel explained proudly. It's probably the largest event we've ever organized. Emily smiled immediately. How many people will be there? Almost 2,000 employees. That's incredible, Sophie whispered excitedly. Daniel nodded proudly before continuing. It's become one of my favorite traditions each year. What happens at the conference? I asked. He smiled immediately. Daniel has always enjoyed talking about his work. We recognize outstanding employees, announce future projects, and celebrate another successful year together. It sounds wonderful. It really is. For several moments, I listened quietly while he spoke passionately about the people working beside him each day. Then Ethan asked a question only children seem brave enough to ask. Does the owner ever come? The entire table laughed softly. No, Daniel smiled. He never does. Why not? No one really knows. I found myself suddenly fascinated by my mashed potatoes. Have you ever met him? Sophie asked curiously. Never. What does he look like? No idea. How old is he? Daniel laughed once again before shrugging his shoulders. That's another mystery. Emily smiled playfully before adding, maybe he's secretly 95 years old. I hope not, Daniel laughed. That would make our succession planning considerably more complicated. Everyone at the table laughed except me. Life occasionally creates moments so absurd they become almost impossible not to smile through. There I sat quietly finishing my dinner while my entire family speculated about my age without realizing I was participating in the conversation. What would you ask him if you ever met him? I asked casually. Daniel paused thoughtfully before answering. I've actually thought about that question before. Oh? He nodded immediately. I think I'd ask him why he chose to remain anonymous all these years. There was something unexpectedly sincere in his answer. And if he refused to tell you? He smiled softly before replying. Then I'd probably thank him anyway. For what? For building something that changes people's lives. For several moments, I found myself unable to answer. Success has always been difficult for me to measure. Money seemed terribly inadequate compared to watching thousands of people build meaningful lives alongside their families because of opportunities created decades ago. Yet somehow, hearing my own son-in-law quietly thank a stranger sitting across the dinner table affected me more than I expected. He sounds like a good man, Sophie smiled innocently. Daniel immediately nodded. I think he probably is. I smiled quietly before changing the subject. There are moments throughout life when remaining silent becomes infinitely more difficult than speaking. This was one of them. Later that evening, while Emily helped the children clean the dining room table, Daniel joined me outside on the back porch. I've been wanting to ask you something, he said carefully. That sounds dangerous. He laughed softly before sitting beside me. Nothing too serious. I feel considerably better already. For several moments, he remained unusually quiet. Then he finally spoke. Dad, have you ever considered moving somewhere smaller? That question surprised me. Why? Well, this house is probably more than you need now. I smiled quietly before replying. I've grown rather fond of needing more than I need. He laughed immediately. You always do that. Do what? Answer simple questions philosophically. I couldn't argue with that observation. I'm serious, he continued. Emily and I have talked about it several times. That immediately caught my attention. You have? He nodded slowly. We worry about you living here alone. There it was again. Love disguised as concern. I appreciate that. I know. He paused briefly before continuing. And there's something else. What's that? I don't think you've ever really enjoyed retirement. That statement surprised me considerably more than anything else he had said that evening. What makes you believe that? He smiled softly before looking toward my garden. Because every time you talk about the past, your eyes change. For several moments, I wasn't entirely sure how to answer him. You miss building things, he continued quietly. I can always tell. Ironically, he had never been more right in his entire life. He simply had absolutely no idea what I had spent my life building. Over the next several weeks, I found myself thinking more often about my conversation with Daniel than I expected. At 72 years old, life has taught me that people rarely say exactly what they mean the first time. More often than not, their truest thoughts reveal themselves quietly between ordinary conversations. Daniel believed I missed building things. He was right. He simply misunderstood what I had chosen to keep building all these years. Many people imagine retirement as the end of something meaningful. For me, it became the beginning of discovering which things were meaningful enough to deserve the rest of my life. My grandchildren deserved that time. My daughter deserved that time. Peace deserved that time. Ironically, the company Daniel dedicated his life to protecting had taught me precisely that lesson decades earlier. 3 weeks later, Emily called unexpectedly one Tuesday afternoon. "Dad, are you busy tomorrow?" "Only if watering roses has suddenly become a full-time profession." She laughed softly. "Daniel has an idea." Those words immediately made me suspicious. Should I be concerned? Probably. That answer worried me considerably more than I cared to admit. "What kind of idea?" "He wants to take you to lunch." I smiled quietly to myself. That doesn't sound particularly dangerous. It isn't. The brief pause that followed immediately informed me otherwise. "Emily? Okay, perhaps slightly dangerous." I laughed before asking the obvious question. "Should I prepare legal representation beforehand?" "You'll survive, Dad." That wasn't particularly reassuring. The following afternoon, Daniel arrived precisely 15 minutes early, something he had somehow managed consistently for the past 12 years. Some people possess extraordinary talents. Daniel's happens to be punctuality. "You look nervous," I observed as we climbed into his car. "I'm practicing." That's somehow considerably more concerning. He laughed quietly before pulling away from my driveway. For almost 20 minutes, our conversation remained pleasantly ordinary. The grandchildren were enjoying school. Emily was planning another family vacation for Christmas. Business was progressing remarkably well. Then, quite suddenly, he became unusually quiet. There are moments throughout life when silence announces difficult conversations long before words arrive. This was one of those moments. "Dad," he finally began carefully, "you know Emily and I love you very much." "Oh dear," I sighed dramatically. "This conversation has become considerably more expensive already." He laughed despite himself. "I'm serious." "So am I." For several moments, he simply smiled before continuing. "We've been worried about you." "Again?" "Always." I couldn't help but laugh softly at his honesty. "That's rather unfortunate for both of us. You make worrying about you surprisingly difficult." Another achievement I'll happily add to my list. That earned me another laugh before he returned to his original thought. "We've talked about this before, but I don't think we've ever really had the conversation." "What conversation?" "About your future." I smiled quietly before looking toward him. "My future?" "Your retirement." There it was once again. "You seem remarkably invested in my retirement." "Only because I plan on stealing all of your best ideas someday." There was that sincerity again. Daniel has always possessed an extraordinary ability to make difficult conversations feel remarkably gentle. He wasn't interrogating me. He was worrying about me. "Dad," he continued carefully, "have you ever considered letting someone help manage things for you?" "What things?" "Your finances, your investments, planning for the future." I smiled quietly before asking, "And who would this remarkably patient individual happen to be?" He laughed immediately. "I may have someone in mind." Somehow, that answer surprised me considerably less than it should have. "You don't trust me to continue managing my own affairs?" "No," he immediately corrected himself. "That's not fair." He paused briefly before continuing. "I trust you completely. I'm worried about what happens if something unexpected happens tomorrow." There it was again. Love disguised as practicality. "I'm perfectly healthy." "I know, and surprisingly difficult to kill." That finally made him laugh loudly enough to attract curious glances from several nearby tables. "I'll certainly remember that if zombies ever become a legitimate concern." For several moments, we both laughed quietly together before he became serious once again. "I mean it, Dad." "I know. Emily worries too." That immediately softened my smile. There are very few things in this world capable of changing my mind faster than knowing my daughter has spent sleepless nights worrying unnecessarily. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Nothing dramatic." His answer arrived considerably faster than I expected, suggesting he had rehearsed this conversation several times beforehand. "I'd just like to help organize things a little better." "And if I said no?" He smiled immediately. "I'd still love you exactly as much tomorrow morning." There was never any manipulation hidden within Daniel's words. That has always been one of the things I admire most about him. He would happily spend 20 years worrying quietly before spending 5 minutes attempting to pressure someone he loved. Can I think about it? Of course. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled mischievously before adding one final observation. You know, I've always wondered something. Oh? How did someone as stubborn as you manage to raise someone as stubborn as Emily? I smiled quietly before looking out the restaurant window. That's easy. How? We both learned from her mother. And for the rest of the afternoon, neither of us realized that this simple conversation about retirement would eventually become the first domino leading toward a truth neither of us was prepared to discover. After my conversation with Daniel, life quietly returned to its familiar rhythm. At least, that's what I believed at the time. Sunday dinners continued exactly as they always had. Sophie proudly announced her latest accomplishments at school. Ethan somehow managed to grow another inch between visits. Emily continued insisting I needed more sweaters despite living in a state where winter barely deserved the name. And Daniel continued worrying about me. Some traditions are simply too deeply rooted to change overnight. What I didn't realize was that my son-in-law had already begun making plans. Several days after our lunch together, Emily called unexpectedly. Dad, she laughed softly. What exactly did you say to Daniel? That question never leads anywhere pleasant. I'm serious. So am I. She laughed before continuing. He's been talking about retirement planning for almost a week now. I'm afraid that's considerably less exciting than you probably hoped. No, she smiled, actually, it's rather sweet. I quietly waited for her to continue. He keeps saying you've spent your entire life taking care of everyone else. There are moments when hearing someone describe you kindly becomes infinitely more uncomfortable than criticism ever could. He gives me considerably more credit than I deserve. I don't think that's possible. For several moments, neither of us spoke. You know, she continued quietly, he really loves you, Dad. I know. No, I don't think you do. That answer surprised me. What do you mean? Emily laughed softly before continuing. You've spent 12 years watching him worry about you. I've spent 12 years watching him worry because of you. There was an important distinction hidden between those two observations. He's terrified something will happen to you someday. That confession unexpectedly left me speechless. When his father passed away, she continued quietly, he promised himself he would never take family for granted again. I had almost forgotten how young Daniel was when he lost his father. He doesn't worry because he thinks you're incapable of taking care of yourself, she continued. He worries because he loves having you here. At 72 years old, I've learned something rather extraordinary about growing older. Eventually, people stop needing your advice. What they never stop needing is simply knowing you're still there. Several weeks passed before I received another unexpected invitation from Daniel. Dad, he asked casually over Sunday dinner, would you like to come to our company's leadership conference next month? That question immediately surprised everyone sitting around the table. You've never invited Dad before, Emily observed curiously. Actually, Daniel smiled sheepishly. I've been trying to convince him for almost 3 years. I laughed immediately. An important detail you somehow neglected to mention. He always says no. Because I enjoy retirement considerably more than corporate conferences. That answer earned several laughs around the dinner table. This year will be different, Daniel insisted confidently. Oh? We're celebrating our company's 50th anniversary. That immediately caught my attention. 50 years. Sometimes numbers have an extraordinary ability to quietly steal the breath from your lungs. 50 years ago, I sat alone inside a tiny rented office, wondering whether I had just made the single greatest mistake of my entire life. Today, thousands of families build meaningful lives because of a dream that seemed impossible all those years ago. 50 years. It's remarkable how quickly an entire lifetime can pass. You should come. Sophie smiled excitedly. Dad says it's beautiful. It really is, Daniel agreed immediately. Besides, I'd love to show you where I work. That sentence almost made me laugh out loud. Life occasionally possesses an extraordinary sense of humor. I don't know, I smiled politely. Corporate events aren't exactly my specialty anymore. Dad, Daniel laughed. All you have to do is sit beside us and enjoy the ceremony. What if I fall asleep? We'll wake you when dinner arrives. What if I accidentally embarrass you? Emily laughed immediately. That has literally never happened in 12 years. For several moments, I quietly considered his invitation. The truth was, I hadn't attended the company's leadership conference in almost 15 years. There are sacrifices that accompany choosing privacy. Watching something you love continue growing from a distance eventually becomes one of them. You don't have to decide right now, Daniel added gently. I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking. That evening, after everyone returned home, I found myself standing quietly inside my study, staring at an old wooden box resting peacefully inside the bottom drawer of my desk. The box itself wasn't particularly valuable. Its contents, however, represented almost 50 years of my life. There are things inside that drawer no one else has ever seen. Not my daughter, not my grandchildren, and certainly not my son-in-law. For 12 years, that drawer has remained quietly locked. Not because I was ashamed of what it contained. Quite the opposite, actually. Some accomplishments simply become easier to protect when the world forgets they belong to you. As I quietly returned the key to its usual hiding place, I couldn't help wondering whether time was finally beginning to ask something different of me. Because for the first time in 12 years, I found myself considering the possibility that perhaps Daniel deserved to know the truth. Neither of us realized then that fate had already made that decision for us. And before another month had passed, a single unexpected moment would begin unlocking every secret I had carefully protected for more than half a century. There is an old saying I've always loved. Life doesn't reveal its greatest surprises all at once. Instead, it quietly places them before us one ordinary moment at a time, until suddenly, nothing is ordinary anymore. 3 weeks before the leadership conference, Daniel called unexpectedly on a Thursday afternoon. "Dad, I need a favor." That immediately caught my attention. In 12 years, I believe that's only the third time you've ever begun a conversation with those words. He laughed softly. "Then I suppose I'm overdue. What do you need?" There was a brief pause before he answered. "I left several documents at home this morning before rushing to the office. Emily has the children today, and she's almost an hour away. And I was wondering if you'd mind bringing them to me." "Of course. It's nothing complicated. I'll text you the address and meet you downstairs when you arrive." I smiled quietly before laughing to myself. "You realize this may officially make me the world's oldest delivery driver." "Trust me," he laughed. "I'll owe you dinner for this." An hour later, I found myself driving toward the company's headquarters, carrying nothing more remarkable than an ordinary leather briefcase resting quietly on the passenger seat beside me. Ironically, I knew every inch of the building long before Daniel ever walked through its front doors. There was something strangely nostalgic about seeing it again after so many years. The company had changed tremendously since I retired. New glass walls had replaced the original entrance. Entire departments had been added over the decades. Hundreds of young professionals hurried confidently across the lobby each day, carrying dreams remarkably similar to the ones I carried 50 years ago. Some things change. Others remain beautifully the same. As I slowly approached the entrance, I couldn't help smiling at the familiar company emblem engraved elegantly above the doors. For 50 years, I had quietly watched it become something infinitely greater than I ever imagined possible. "Dad!" Daniel's voice immediately pulled me back to the present as he hurried across the lobby toward me. "Thank you for doing this. I expect my payment in the form of apple pie." "Done." There was something amusing about watching my son-in-law transform from confident CEO into grateful son whenever our family gathered together. He quickly took the briefcase before gesturing proudly toward the enormous lobby surrounding us. "So, what do you think?" "It's beautiful." He smiled immediately. "It really is." There was genuine pride in his voice now. "We just finished renovating this section last year." For almost 15 minutes, he enthusiastically showed me around the building. New conference rooms, employee lounges, expanded training facilities. Every improvement represented another chapter in a story that began long before either of us realized our lives would eventually become connected. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel. A young woman hurried across the lobby carrying several folders before stopping suddenly beside us. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were busy." "It's all right," Daniel smiled warmly. "This is my father-in-law, William Carter." Her expression immediately brightened. "It's wonderful to finally meet you, Mr. Carter. We've heard so much about you." "Oh dear," I laughed quietly. "Should I be concerned about that?" Everyone laughed softly before she hurried away toward another meeting. Moments later, another employee stopped to greet us. Then another, and another. Each conversation was remarkably similar. "It's wonderful to finally meet you. Daniel talks about you all the time. Thank you for raising such an incredible family." By the time we finally reached the executive offices, I found myself unexpectedly emotional. Leadership has very little to do with titles. Everything worthwhile about it can always be discovered by listening carefully to how people speak about someone when they aren't required to do so. These people genuinely admired my son-in-law. I couldn't have been more proud of him if I tried. "You've built something wonderful here," I smiled quietly. He immediately shook his head. "No, Dad. I simply inherited something wonderful. Those words unexpectedly lingered quietly between us for several moments. Then he smiled mischievously before adding, although I may take partial credit for improving the coffee. That finally made me laugh. As we stood quietly overlooking the city from his office window, I realized something rather extraordinary. For 5 years, I had worried whether Daniel truly deserved everything this company represented. At that moment, I quietly discovered I had been asking the wrong question all along. The truth wasn't whether he deserved the company. The truth was that the company deserved someone exactly like him. What neither of us realized that afternoon was how dramatically our relationship was about to change. Because resting quietly inside his office sat a document neither of us had noticed. A document scheduled to arrive 3 weeks before the leadership conference. A document carrying my signature. And within days, Daniel would accidentally discover something impossible to explain away. The retired old man he had spent 12 years worrying about had never truly retired at all. 3 days after my visit to the company, Daniel received a call that would quietly change everything. At first, he assumed it was nothing more than another routine matter requiring his approval. After 5 years as CEO, his days had become remarkably predictable. Meetings, financial reports, strategic planning, endless decisions patiently waiting for him each morning before his first cup of coffee had even grown cold. This was supposed to be one of those ordinary days. He was wrong. Daniel, his executive assistant, said carefully as she entered his office, "The chairman's office has requested your attendance at tomorrow's board meeting." He smiled immediately. "Tomorrow? I don't believe we have one scheduled." "We didn't." That answer immediately caught his attention. "Oh?" She hesitated briefly before continuing. "They've requested all executive leadership members attend." "What's the agenda?" "I'm afraid they didn't say." For several moments, Daniel simply nodded thoughtfully. Unexpected board meetings are rarely ordinary occurrences. In 5 years as CEO, he could count on one hand the number of times something similar had happened. His first assumption was remarkably reasonable. Perhaps the board intended to announce another major expansion before the leadership conference next month. His second assumption proved considerably more amusing in retrospect. He briefly wondered whether the mysterious founder had finally decided to attend the company's 50th anniversary celebration after half a century of remaining invisible. Impossible, of course. Or so everyone believed. The following morning, Daniel arrived unusually early, carrying little more than professional curiosity and an excellent cup of coffee. By 9 o'clock, nearly every executive officer had gathered inside the boardroom. Something immediately felt different. No one seemed willing to speculate openly about why they had been summoned so unexpectedly. Instead, quiet conversations filled the room while everyone patiently waited for someone else to discover the answer first. Then, precisely 9 minutes before the meeting began, the chairman entered carrying several folders. Without speaking, he quietly placed one before every member sitting around the table. Daniel immediately noticed something unusual about the document resting before him. Confidential. That wasn't entirely uncommon. What caught his attention was the second line printed immediately beneath it. Authorization for 50th anniversary corporate transition ceremony. Corporate transition? That immediately made no sense whatsoever. The company wasn't being sold. No acquisition discussions had occurred during previous board meetings. Nothing within their strategic plans remotely suggested leadership changes were approaching. Quietly opening the folder before him, Daniel began reading, then suddenly stopped. For several moments, he became convinced he had somehow received the wrong document entirely. His eyes immediately returned to the first paragraph, then the second, then the final page. Corporate transition, founder authorization, transfer ceremony, special recognition announcement, and finally one sentence that immediately stole his breath away. The founder will personally attend this year's leadership conference. The room immediately exploded with quiet conversations. What? That can't be right. After 50 years? Has anyone actually met him? Daniel remained completely silent. He had spent 5 years believing he would retire long before ever discovering the answer to that particular mystery. Apparently, he had been mistaken. The chairman smiled patiently before allowing the excitement throughout the room to settle naturally. "Yes," he laughed quietly. "I imagine everyone's reaction this morning is remarkably similar." "When did this happen?" one executive immediately asked. "Several weeks ago, and he's definitely attending?" The chairman smiled knowingly before replying, "Without question." For the next 30 minutes, endless speculation filled the room. How old was he? Why now? Would he finally reveal his identity publicly? Had he remained involved with the company throughout all these years? No one possessed any answers whatsoever. No one except the chairman himself. Ironically, Daniel discovered he was considerably more excited than he expected. After 5 years of protecting something another man created, he would finally have the opportunity to thank him personally. What he didn't realize was that he had already thanked him hundreds of times over Sunday dinner. Later that afternoon, Daniel called Emily almost immediately after returning home. "You are absolutely not going to believe this." That opening sentence immediately earned her complete attention. "What happened?" "The founder is coming." There was a brief silence before she asked the obvious question. "What founder?" "Our founder." "The mysterious one?" He laughed immediately. "As opposed to all of the other mysterious founders currently hiding throughout my office building?" "Yes, that founder." Emily immediately laughed. "You're serious?" "Completely." For several moments, neither of them spoke. "That's incredible." "It really is." Then suddenly, another thought occurred to him. "We should invite Dad." "What?" "He would love this." The irony of that statement would have been considerably more amusing had either of them understood its significance. "Why?" Emily asked curiously. Daniel smiled quietly before answering. "Because if there's one person who has taught me what success actually means, it's your father." For perhaps the 1,000th time in 12 years, my son-in-law unknowingly found himself speaking the truth. He simply had no idea how much truth his words actually contained. And within 3 short weeks, the retired old man he had spent 12 years protecting would walk onto a stage carrying a secret impossible to hide any longer. The closer the leadership conference became, the more excited Daniel seemed to grow. For nearly a month, our Sunday dinners became surprisingly centered around one particular topic. "The founder. You still haven't changed your mind?" he asked one Sunday afternoon. "About what?" "You know perfectly well what." I smiled quietly before taking another sip of my coffee. "I enjoy pretending otherwise." Emily laughed immediately. "Dad has been doing that successfully for 72 years. "I've noticed," Daniel replied. He leaned forward slightly before continuing his argument for perhaps the 20th time that month. "Dad, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." "For whom?" "For both of us." That answer immediately caught my attention. "Oh? You've spent your entire life teaching me that success isn't measured by money or titles. I'd love for you to meet someone who built something extraordinary without sacrificing those values." For several moments, I simply smiled quietly at him. Life occasionally rewards us with moments so wonderfully ironic that all we can do is appreciate them in silence. "Besides," he continued enthusiastically, "I've wanted to thank him for years." "What would you say?" He smiled thoughtfully before answering. "Honestly, always. I'd probably thank him for giving people like me opportunities we could never have imagined." There was absolutely nothing rehearsed about his answer. No carefully constructed corporate response designed to impress anyone listening nearby. It was simply the truth. "You admire him quite a bit." "I do." "More than you admire retirement?" I asked playfully. He laughed immediately. "Let's not say anything ridiculous." That finally earned him another laugh from everyone sitting around the dinner table. Several days later, Sophie unexpectedly solved a problem neither Daniel nor I realized existed. "Grandpa has to go," she announced confidently while coloring beside the dining room table. "Oh?" Emily smiled. "And why is that?" "Because someday I'm going to tell everyone my grandfather met the founder." There are remarkably few things in this world more difficult to argue with than the determined logic of an 8-year-old little girl. "See?" Daniel smiled triumphantly. "Even Sophie agrees with me. I'm beginning to suspect this family has formed some sort of conspiracy." "Oh, we've absolutely formed a conspiracy," Emily laughed immediately. "I should have realized much sooner that retirement offers remarkably few defenses against 4 people determined to love you simultaneously." 3 days before the conference, Daniel arrived unexpectedly at my home carrying an enormous garment bag. I immediately became suspicious. "What exactly is that?" "A solution." "To which problem?" He smiled mischievously before handing me the bag. "The one involving your refusal to dress appropriately for important occasions." Carefully opening it, I discovered an exceptionally beautiful navy blue suit waiting patiently inside. "Daniel, no arguments." "It's beautiful." "I know." For several moments, I simply stood quietly looking at the suit before smiling warmly at him. "You didn't need to do this." "I know." There was something remarkably familiar about that answer. "You really aren't going to let this go, are you?" "Not a chance." "Even after 12 years?" He laughed softly before placing his hand gently upon my shoulder. especially after 12 years. Those words unexpectedly stayed with me long after he returned home that evening, especially after 12 years. For 12 years, he had quietly worried about my happiness, protected my dignity, loved my daughter faithfully, helped raise my grandchildren with extraordinary kindness and patience. For 12 years, he had unknowingly protected something that ultimately belonged to me without ever asking for recognition in return. And somehow, despite knowing absolutely nothing about who I truly was, he had become precisely the kind of man I would have chosen myself to help lead everything I spent my lifetime building. Perhaps that realization affected me more profoundly than I care to admit. That night, I quietly opened the bottom drawer of my desk one final time before removing the old wooden box resting patiently inside. Some secrets are protected because we fear losing them. Others are protected because we fear losing ourselves once they're revealed. Mine had always been both. Slowly opening the box, I found myself smiling at photographs taken more than 50 years ago, newspaper clippings from another lifetime, letters written by people whose names now decorate buildings throughout our company, and finally, resting quietly beneath everything else, sat a single document carrying my signature. The original incorporation papers. For 50 years, I had protected what that signature represented. Now, for the very first time in 12 years, I quietly wondered whether protecting it had perhaps become less important than finally sharing it. Because in 48 hours, my son-in-law would walk beside me into a conference hall filled with thousands of employees. He believed he was bringing his retired father-in-law to meet the founder of his company. He couldn't possibly imagine he had spent 12 years calling him dad. There are moments in life that divide everything into two distinct chapters. Before and after. The morning of the leadership conference began remarkably quietly. For nearly an hour, I sat alone beside my garden holding a cup of coffee while watching the sunrise slowly paint the sky beyond my roses. There was something strangely poetic about beginning such an extraordinary day, exactly as every ordinary day had begun for the past 15 years. Peacefully. At precisely 8 o'clock, Daniel arrived at my front door wearing the same smile he had carried throughout the previous month. "You look incredible," he smiled warmly while admiring the navy blue suit he had chosen for me. "You sound surprised." "I am. Should I be offended?" "Only slightly." We both laughed quietly before beginning the short drive toward the conference center. "I still can't believe you're finally coming," he admitted enthusiastically. "Neither can I." That answer proved considerably more truthful than he realized. Throughout the entire drive, he spoke excitedly about the conference schedule, recognition ceremonies, leadership presentations, the special announcement everyone had spent weeks speculating about, and finally, the moment he had waited 5 years to witness, meeting the founder. "You know," he smiled thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about what I'd like to say to him." "Oh? I don't think I'll thank him for building the company." That answer surprised me. "No?" He quietly shook his head. "Companies can always be rebuilt." For several moments, neither of us spoke. "What would you thank him for, then?" He smiled warmly before answering. "For trusting people like me enough to protect what he spent his entire life creating." At 72 years old, I have discovered there are moments when words simply become inadequate. This was one of them. Nearly 40 minutes later, we finally arrived at the conference center. Thousands of employees had already begun gathering throughout the enormous ballroom. Excitement filled every conversation surrounding us as people quietly speculated about the founder's long-awaited appearance. No one knew who he was. No one except 3 members of the board. And me. "Dad," Daniel smiled proudly while guiding me toward our seats, "I have the perfect view reserved for us." Ironically, he couldn't possibly have chosen a more appropriate location. We sat together quietly throughout the opening presentations, while hundreds of employees were recognized for their extraordinary contributions throughout the year. Then, finally, the chairman slowly walked toward the center of the stage. The entire room immediately became silent. "For 50 years," he began warmly, "this company has been more than a business. It has been a family." Thunderous applause immediately filled the ballroom. 50 years ago, one man began building something extraordinary inside a tiny rented office, with little more than a dream and an unwavering belief in people. Daniel smiled quietly beside me. For half a century, he has remained invisible by choice, never seeking recognition, never asking for applause, simply watching proudly as generations of families built meaningful lives together. The entire room had become perfectly silent now. "Today," the chairman continued softly, "for the very first time, he has chosen to stand before the people he has quietly loved for more than 50 years." For several moments, he paused, before smiling warmly toward our section of the ballroom. William Carter, would you please join me on stage? Time has a remarkable ability to slow itself during life's most extraordinary moments. I slowly turned toward Daniel. The expression upon my son-in-law's face is something I will treasure for the remainder of my life. Confusion, disbelief, and finally, complete astonishment. No, he whispered quietly. For several moments, he simply stared at me while thousands of people throughout the ballroom slowly rose to their feet in applause. No, he repeated softly, though this time tears had already begun filling his eyes. I smiled warmly before placing my hand gently upon his shoulder. I'm afraid I've been keeping a rather embarrassing secret from you. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He simply sat there, staring at the retired old man he had spent 12 years protecting. You, he whispered softly. You've always. Yes. The company. Yes. All these years? I smiled quietly before nodding once. All these years. There are moments throughout our lives when everything we believed suddenly transforms into something infinitely more beautiful than we ever imagined possible. This was one of those moments. As I slowly walked toward the stage, something extraordinary happened. More than 2,000 employees quietly stood and saluted, not the founder of their company, but simply an old man they had never met before that morning. Looking back toward my family one final time, I discovered Daniel quietly wiping tears from his face while smiling through his astonishment. Later that evening, after everyone else had finally returned home, he quietly sat beside me on my back porch. You know something? He laughed softly through another embarrassed smile. What's that? For 12 years, I've been worried about your retirement account. Yes, I smiled. I noticed. He laughed loudly enough to startle the birds resting quietly throughout my garden. I suppose that's rather ridiculous now. No, I replied warmly. It's rather beautiful. He smiled quietly before asking one final question. Why didn't you ever tell me? I considered his question carefully before answering. Because I never wanted you to love me for what I built. And now? I smiled warmly toward my son. Now I know you never did. Money eventually disappears. Titles eventually fade. Even extraordinary accomplishments quietly become memories with enough. Family never does. And after 72 wonderful years, I have discovered there is no greater success than being loved simply for who you are.